Hey, what's going on, guys? There has been a lot of talk over the past couple months about UFC 300, which goes down on April 13th. And I think UFC 300 is going to be terrible, but not for the reason you're probably thinking. I'm going to break that down in this video, as well as I'm going to give my final prediction for UFC 300's main card. I'm going to go over all that in this video because supposedly, keyword supposedly, tonight, we are going to get some news regarding UFC 300 from Dana White. As soon as that news comes out, I will make a video about it, so make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. But over the past month or two, which is crazy because UFC 300 isn't until April 13th, which is 4.5 months away, essentially, or really 4 months away from right now. It's mid-January, which is craziness. But really, over the past 2 months, so essentially 6 months out from UFC 300, I've seen complaint after complaint after complaint about UFC 300. And I'm a person, I'll be the first to complain about something I don't like when the UFC does it. I complained about UFC 297, which is coming up in about a week. It's a horrible pay-per-view card. But we have to wait and see before we preemptively just dog a card. And you've had people literally 6 months out from the card, 5 months out from the card. Now we're 4 months out from the card, complaining about UFC 300 before they even get the announcement from Dana White. And I think the reason for that is whether it's the UFC or Dana White themselves overselling it, fans have way too high of expectations for UFC 300. They're expecting like some catastrophically crazy card with 5 title fights and top 10 contenders all over the prelims. And I know Dana White has kind of set that precedent by saying, you know, every single prelim is going to be amazing. You're going to be like, I can't believe this is a prelim. And I know he's built that up, but I think people are jumping the gun saying, oh yeah, UFC 300 is going to be terrible. It's going to be horrible. It might be disappointing for some people, but I don't think the real reason it's going to be terrible isn't the reason you're thinking of at all. But I want to go over the current card right now because UFC 300, as it sits right now, we basically have 2 main card fights. Right now, we have Yuri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic, and we also have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. Those are almost guaranteed main card fights. Hasn't been made official, but I would assume probably 99% that it will be main card fights. Then also for the prelims, we have Calvin Kattar versus Aljamain Sterling, which is a very solid prelim. And then we also have Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumditch, which I'm not super excited for that matchup. I would have loved to see Bo Nickel test it. But at the end of the day, Bo Nickel is a hot prospect in the middleweight division, so it is a relatively decent fight, especially for a prelim. So right now, and again, I'm not going to go over the entire card of trying to guess every prelim that's going to be on the card, but right now in terms of main card, you know, we got, a little less than 50% of the card right now because it's going to be a 5-fight main card most likely. We have Yuri Prochazka, Alexander Rakic, and Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. I've reacted to both those fights already. I will link it down in the description in case you want a more in-depth breakdown of that. I love those fights. I absolutely love those fights. I mean, those are top-tier fights. One in the light heavyweight division, Yuri Prochazka, former champion, coming off a loss to Alex Pereira. Then you have Alexander Rakic coming back from an injury, was supposed to fight Jan Blachowicz in January. Jan Blachowicz got injured, had to pull out. I think this is a banger matchup, and I think this is very telling for the light heavyweight division and puts the winner of this fight in title contention. Also, Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan, similar situation. That's a massive fight for the lightweight division, and the winner of that fight will undoubtedly be in title contention. So Dana White's already said it. That doesn't necessarily mean it's concrete, but I believe most likely the winner of that fight will get a title shot in their next fight or maybe one more fight away, but I believe most likely it will be in their next fight. It might not be Islam Makhachev's next title defense, but I believe that it will be a title fight for the winner of that fight. Plus, just on paper, both those fights are banger fights. Charles Oliveira, one of the most exciting fighters on the roster. Yuri Prochazka, one of the most exciting fighters on the roster. Now, what else are they going to add to UFC 300 to make it even better? Well, that leaves us with room for 3 fights. So I'm going to go up kind of the bout order I think it will be, which I believe the first fight of the night or first opening main card fight will be Yuri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic. Then I believe it'll be Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. Then the featured fight on the main card, I believe, will be Weili Zhang defending her strawweight title against Yan Xiaonan. This is a fight that's been supposedly in the works for a bit now. It was supposed to take place, there was talk or rumors of it taking place when they were going to do a UFC China, which ultimately did not happen. This fight has to happen at some point. It's the next fight to make in the division. The division, sooner rather than later, it's going to start getting a little bit log jam. Not really, because Weili Zhang really has fought the who's who in the division, but at some point this fight has to happen. And I just find it hard to believe that the UFC is going to make UFC 300 and not throw a women's MMA fight on the main card, which a lot of the time, and I'm not one of these women's MMA haters, a lot of the time they do it and it's like, why is this fight on the main card of a pay-per-view? With this particular fight, and again, because I'm putting this fight as the feature fight, that means there's 3 title fights on this card. With this particular fight, I think it's a banger women's MMA fight. Weili Zhang, Yan Xiaonan, banger fight. Looking forward to it. I think that will be the featured fight on the card. Or they could surprise us and maybe do Weili Zhang versus Alexa Grasso for the straw or for the flyweight title. I don't think that's going to happen. I think they're going to make Valentina Shevchenko Grasso 3. Maybe UFC Noche again. So I don't think that's going to happen, even though there's been some rumors of that. Okay, so what is the co-main event? I believe the co-main event will be Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title. And I know a lot of people have been crapping on this fight left and right, and I've already made a dedicated video on that. I love this matchup. You have 2 guys on very long winning streaks. You have 2 guys that fought each other, but we never got to see the conclusion of that fight due to an eye poke, even though people act like it was a one-sided destruction beatdown. But again, that was damn near 4 years ago at this point. And, this is a matchup in the welterweight division that absolutely needs to happen. And I think it's a compelling matchup. You have a guy in Leon Edwards, very good striker, very good grappler, and just overall very well-rounded. But you have a guy in Belal Muhammad, very good cardio, very good pressure. And we've seen Leon Edwards kind of wilt a little bit under pressure, even lost the 5th round against Colby Covington or got controlled a bit in the 5th round against Colby Covington. So I think this is a phenomenal welterweight matchup. I think it's the fight that needs to get made. And also because the fans are so this can't be a main event, blah, 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 even though I think this could main event UFC 300 and I have no problem with it. I do understand the fans are looking for something a bit more than this as a UFC 300 main event. And also the UFC might say, okay, well, since fans aren't absolutely in love with this matchup, let's use it to stack UFC 300 instead of having it headline its own pay-per-view, where maybe it doesn't do as good on pay-per-view. So we'll just stack this card, and that way we can say we have 3 title fights on UFC 300. Okay, what do I believe will be the main event? The main event, I believe, will be Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill for the light heavyweight championship. And I think that's a banger matchup. Jamal Hill never lost a belt. He beat the brakes off of Glover Teixeira. Unfortunately, he tears his Achilles playing basketball. And then Yuri comes back. We were supposed to see Hill versus Yuri. Yuri comes back, fights Pereira, who's coming off a win over Jan Blachowicz. And Pereira goes out there and stops Yuri Prochazka to win the light heavyweight title. I think this is the fight to make. You have Alex Pereira, who's kind of hinting on Instagram that he's coming back soon. I know there is a Brazilian pay-per-view supposedly in May, so maybe this fight gets pushed back to then. But that is the card I think will be made. And I think that's a phenomenal card. I think Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill is a more than amazing main event. I love that fight. The stylistic clash, the storyline of kind of the back and forth. Alex Pereira is kind of always throwing shade at different fighters and kind of has a unique way of talking trash. Then you have Jamal Hill, who really can't control his anger, gets, angry over every little bit of trash talk and is super petty and is super bitter 24/7. I think it makes her a kind of enjoyable build-up. And I think just on paper, for the people who actually just care about the best versus the best, that is the fight to make right now. Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill. So I love that fight card. So here's my final UFC 300 fight card. My prediction for hopefully what we find out tonight. That's Alex Pereira versus Jamal Hill, light heavyweight main event. Co-main event, Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title. Featured fight on the card, Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan for the women's strawweight title. Then we have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan and Yuri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic. First off, before I even get into any discussion further than this, let me know if that was the UFC 300 main card. Would you be satisfied with that main card? Would you think that was a great UFC 300 worthy main card? I'm genuinely curious because my opinion is that it is. I think that's an amazing card. I will applaud that card. There's no way I will hate on that card. Now, just a couple other kind of wild card matchups that could be on UFC 300 that maybe they replace Pereira and Hill with something else. These are kind of all main events. And I'm not saying I love any of these. I'm just saying these are kind of wild cards that could come out of the blue. One would be GSP Nick Diaz. Hate the fight. I would hate UFC 300 if this got made as the main event. But it seems like the rumors kind of were drummed up for a while, and now they kind of cooled down. GSP has come out and said, I'm not fighting anymore. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But that's still a wild card matchup that could happen. Another fight that could be the main event, Alex Pereira versus Israel Adesanya at 205 for the light heavyweight title. That is a legitimate fight that could get put together, that could shock us all tonight and could get announced. Does that actually happen? I think that's a bad career decision right now for Israel Adesanya, but it could very well happen, and that would be a banger main event. But I don't love that. I don't think Adesanya deserves a light heavyweight title shot. I think he should have to win a fight there before he fights Pereira, but the trilogy, no doubt, would be insanity. Then also, this is another matchup I've seen people kind of cheerleading, but I hate, and that's Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway for the BMF title. Now, maybe this wouldn't be the main event, but I could see them making this the co-main event. I don't want to see that fight at all. And also, Max Holloway recently said on stream that he won't be fighting on UFC 300, but we know how protective Dana White is of these big cards. He got mad about UFC 200 getting leaked with Brock Lesnar. Maybe Holloway was just, oh no, I'm not fighting on 300, but he knows deep down he actually is, but they've been told to be tight-lipped about the information. So Gaethje Holloway BMF title fight could be the co-main or even main of 300, but I really wouldn't want to see that. I hate the BMF title, and I hate that fight in general. Then lastly, they could really shock us with Conor McGregor versus Michael Chandler. It seems like all the options for McGregor right now are kind of drying up, with Diaz and Masvidal drying up. And, you know, I know McGregor announced that he's fighting Chandler. That is not official. That is not signed. The UFC has not announced that. I did an entire video on that. You can go check it out on the channel. But those are some wild card matchups. But let's stick to the card that I actually think is going to happen, which this is pure speculation. I don't have any inside info. This is pure speculation. So the full card that I think will happen at UFC 300, I absolutely love it. I think it's an incredible card. But Joey, if that's such an incredible card and you think it's an incredible card, why do you think UFC 300 is going to be terrible, but not for the reason you think? Because a lot of people have been saying, oh, UFC 300 is going to be terrible, blah, blah, blah. That card's amazing. In my opinion, that's like a 9 out of 10, maybe even a 9.5 out of 10. If you grade the UFC 300 card, the main card that I just supplied you, I think that's an incredible card. I think some people will still be disappointed with that. They're expecting like some crazy spectacle main event, but I still think that's a solid card. Well, Joey, then why is it terrible? Well, I want to break down to you UFC 298 and UFC 299 first. So I'm going to go over these really quickly. UFC 298. The notable fights on the card, we have Jeff Neal versus Ian Machado Gary. We have Tai Tuivasa versus Marcin Tybura. We have Merab Dvalishvili versus Henry Cejudo. We have Robert Whittaker versus Paulo Costa. And for the main event, we have Alexander Volkanovski versus Ilia Topuria. This card is absolutely stacked, even potentially on the prelims. Anthony Hernandez versus Ikram Alaskarov. Potentially on the prelims, Tatiana Suarez versus Amanda Lemos. Most likely on the prelims. So UFC 298, which is in mid-February, is absolutely stacked. Then you look at UFC 299, the main event, Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Chito Vera 2. Co-main event, Dustin Poirier versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Feature fight on the card, Gilbert Burns, Jack Della Maddalena. Then you go down, Curtis Blades, Jalton Almeida, Piotr Jan, Song Yudong, Kevin Holland versus Michael Venom Page, Pedro Munoz versus Kyler Phillips, Mateusz Gamrot versus Rafael Dos Anjos, Michel Pereira versus Michael Olashechek. I mean, this is $299. I said this in a recent video. $299 may be the real UFC 300. But, I mean, $299 is looking absolutely incredible. It doesn't have that, like, spectacle main event. But $299 is incredible stacked, $298 is incredibly stacked, and now $300, based off of my card that I just presented to you, is stacked as well. So what's absolutely terrible about UFC 300 are the fight cards that are going to follow UFC 300, because they are using up all this talent on UFC 298 and UFC 299 and UFC 300. We're going to get some god-awful cards come May, June. And I just really think it's going to be one of those things where I'm going to love watching 298. I'm going to love watching 299. I'm going to love watching UFC 300. I'm going to love covering all the cards. But I think when we start to get to some Mackenzie Dern Apex main events, some Holly Holm Apex main events, we're going to be like, man, we really got those amazing cards, but we are suffering in May and June, at least at the bare minimum. Maybe they start to pick it up in July. But when you put that much talent and you stack the cards that crazily, which I applaud the UFC for. And again, this is like a minor complaint, but I just know come June, come July, come May, we're going to be complaining about this. I think the cards are going to be paper thin. I mean, look at UFC 297 right now. look at UFC 297. It's one of the worst cards I've ever seen. I mean, you have Sean Strickland, Dricus du Plessis, main event. After that, it falls off a cliff. I mean, take a look at it for yourself. It's horrible. I made an entire video about how bad it is. What do you think 301 is going to look like? What do you think 302 is going to look like? What do you think that card that Conor McGregor is going to headline most likely is going to look like? It's going to look atrocious. It's going to look horrible because they front-loaded UFC in 2024, and then we're going to pay for it on the back end as fans. So while people are complaining, oh, UFC 300 is going to be disappointing, I think those people are over-exaggerating. If the fights come out and they're horrible, I'll be the first to make a video, and I'll even say, all right, look, I was wrong. But even if UFC 300 is a little bit more underwhelming than I predicted in this video, which it's pure speculation, it may be underwhelming compared to what I predicted. When you look at 298, 299, and 300, even what they've only announced for 300 so far, those cards afterwards, they're going to be running thin. They're going to be running thin on elite level fighters, and that's when we start to get some more UFC 297s. Or what was a really bad card? UFC 272, Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal. That was a horrible card. We start getting cards like that. UFC 258, Kamaru Usman, Gilbert Burns. I know that card was horrible. Or the Conor McGregor, Cowboy Cerrone. That card was horrible. And I know we're getting way back now. But when you stack these cards, card after card, you're going to run out of some talent on the back end. And it kind of came to fruition in January a little bit because 269, or not 269, I'm sorry, I'm thinking way back now. I believe that's Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira. But 296, I mixed up the numbers, and even 295 were very stacked. And now they weren't even as crazy stacked as 298 and 299. And look kind of what we got in January. And I think also that's part of the fact that you have, you know, a lot of fighters that don't want to fight over the holidays or don't want to have training camps over the holidays. So I think that's part of it as well. But I just really think we're going to be looking at some ugly fight night cards and some ugly pay-per-views after UFC 300. So that's why I wanted to make this video. I think people are being a little bit too hard on Dane and the UFC, saying, you know, oh, this UFC 300 is going to be terrible when we already seen some amazing fights on the card. I think people have set their expectations too high. And I think in reality, they're just being too hard on the UFC. And I think what's really going to bite us is after UFC 300. There's going to be a period where we're in a lull and we're like, oh my goodness, I can't wait to get back to some good pay-per-views. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.